Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Hela. She was bound to get the uniform and a T4 upgrade since she is featured in the What If series, which is the theme for this update. A lot of people have been asking me whether this character is worth upgrading, whether it's getting her new uniform or taking her to T4, and the main reason behind that is because the devs didn't give her an iframe ignore to her third skill or just in her kit with the latest uniform. She didn't have it before, and a lot of people assumed that she would get it with her latest uniform since she was pretty much only used for PvP. Yet she still didn't get it, and that kind of put a lot of doubt on whether the character would actually be a good standalone character in PvP and worth T4ing. The short answer of this is if a character doesn't have a staple effect like iframe ignore for PvP, then they generally won't be able to be a good standalone character or viable for things like timeline battle outside of just being a support for the most part. With that said, I'm going to see what the new uniform brings for her in regards to her PvE performance as well as her PvP, and see how much of an impact the T4 makes specifically in PvP, since that is where most people will be using her. As a heads up, my build on Hela is pretty stacked. I believe I'm around rank 9 with her, but I'm not using a damage proc and I won't be for the PvE testing. I actually have a brilliant CTP of regen, which is what I'll be using for that and the PvP testing. And besides that, I have Odins in every slot, a type 6 enhancement, and a 6-star artifact. One thing I noticed right away with the new uniform is that she is significantly better in PvE content. She was able to essentially beat stage 9 of Null almost in 60 seconds flat. When I took her to stage 29 without using her leadership or supports, she was able to beat the stage with about a minute and 30 seconds left, which is actually quite good even for having max Odins, but also for not having a damage proc. For those wondering how the old uniform holds up, I was about 40 seconds slower completing the same stage under the same conditions with the old one compared to the new one. Because Hela's restrictions in World Boss Legend have a good amount of supports available, when I did add in a leadership and supports, she was able to do stage 39 of Null quite comfortably with about 2 minutes left. If you want to build a character specifically for PvE, a CTP of Rage might be the most ideal option. You do have to delay cancel the 4th skill a little bit so she isn't absolutely proc friendly, but I would kind of advise against building her that way since she has so much more value in PvP. If you do want to get value out of her in PvE as well, a CTP of Destruction is probably your most ideal bet since you'll have a proc and penetration for both PvP and PvE. As you can see from this clip, I wasn't able to complete stage 79 without a damage proc, but I was about 40 seconds off and should give a good comparison of the upgrade that she gets once I get her to level 80 and then T4. You can see from this clip that once I get the character to level 80, I'm able to complete the first phase easily, about a minute faster than before when she was at level 70, and then am able to complete the stage entirely with almost a minute and 50 seconds left. Even though I have a regen build on the character, she is still quite tanky even without it, and is quite easy to play in World Boss Legend, mostly because she has a ton of good defensive abilities, including a few iframes that you can hide in, as well as barrier on her 4th skill, and a very lengthy 7 seconds of invincible on the 5th skill, on top of the 30% healing that you get when it's activated, on a fairly short cooldown, which is around 9 seconds or so if you have full cooldown in your kit. This makes fighting bosses like Mephisto easier compared to other characters, since you can not only tank his annoying persistent fire damage, but when you use the 3rd skill, you also accumulate damage taken and end up dealing more damage to him. I wasn't able to complete stage 59 of Gore with Hela, but did end up getting pretty close. The main issue in this fight is that her 5th skill has a pretty long animation, and if Gore moves around, which he does a lot, then you basically get animation locked and lose a lot of time doing that skill while Gore is not being hit. This issue is basically twofold in the Dark Phoenix fight, since she also ends up moving around a lot and you really have to time your rotations to avoid her telegraphed attacks. On top of that, as you're dealing damage to her, if you don't end up proccing exactly how you want, that bar that she has at the top constantly fills up and just keeps interrupting you even more, just burning a lot of time. If or when you upgrade Hela to T4, you'll notice that the biggest stat bump that she gets outside of the instinct is for her HP. For my build, she went up past 40,000, and the next closest was energy attack, which was almost 10,000 and is still pretty good. The T4 skill isn't really anything special. It's actually pretty unimaginative if you ask me. They could have done a ton of things with her being related to hell and impacting characters' revives or possibly their mortality or things like that. But the main value that you get from the T4 on that skill is basically the striker effect. For PvE, you'd basically just want to use whatever your best striker is, so that would usually be characters like Thor or Ghost Rider. However, for PvP, I would highly recommend that you use a character that has an iframe ignore and penetration in the same skill. Since Hela does lack penetration in her kit, once she activates her T4, you'll basically get the benefit of not only that iframe ignore that she also lacks, but the penetration on top of that. So characters that I would recommend for that would be ones like Wolverine, you have Spider-Man, Hulk, Ghost Rider, and even ones like Agent Venom if you don't have a bunch of T4 characters. You'll see that that T4 skill, especially with a good striker, does make a significant difference with her performance. She's able to complete this stage about 1 minute and 40 seconds faster than when she was just at level 80. Because at level 80 she already completed the stage fairly quickly, she doesn't show as much of an improvement here, and completes the stage about 1 minute faster than before. Her improvement on Gore was much more significant though, since she's able to do much more damage to him before he just jumps around and interrupts your attacks, and was able to complete this stage well over 1 minute and 40 seconds faster, considering that she got down to the last 3 health bars when she was at level 80. Similarly, in the Dark Phoenix fight, she had an improvement of over 1 minute, even though she completes the stage with 1 minute left, since at level 80 I only got down to the last 7 health bars before time ran out. So you can see that Hela is actually quite good in World Boss Legend, though I can't say the same for ABX and ABL. Although she does have all the cancel effects for the various different seasons, she just doesn't work that well here, mostly because you have to rely on damage taken to increase her overall damage, which doesn't really occur often in this mode, and on top of that she has a restricted number of hits, mostly because you rely on the 2nd, 4th, and 5th skill to do hits, and you can't really cancel too many of your skills to layer the hits and just amass a lot of them on top of one another, especially because you have to stay in your ultimate skill and you can't cancel it like some of the very good ABX and ABL characters out there. If you notice in the first ABX clip, she wasn't even able to hit 9 million with 2 supports and no damage proc, even with having all of those Odins, which is pretty much standard in my build for characters to hit that if they don't have a damage proc. And in the follow-up, when she is T4, she was able to hit around 10 million, which means that with a CTP of Rage, it would probably be closer to around 12 million or something like that, which should really be well over 13 million if she was actually good in this mode. And then in ABL, the expected score would have been somewhere close to 6 million with no damage proc and 2 supports and a leadership, but she only ends up getting close to 5.5 or 5.6 million. She does quite decently in Giant Boss Raid. Even at level 70, I was able to complete the first phase of Dormammu in about 60 seconds, which means that she could easily complete this fight by herself, even without a damage proc at level 70. If you're using a single skill damage proc for the character, you'd likely just quick cancel all the skills from 1 leading up to 5, so that would be a 1 cancel, 2 cancel, 3 cancel, 4 cancel, 5. However, to get the most damage out of the rotation, you'd likely want to do a 1 cancel, 3 cancel, 2 slight delay cancel, 4 slight delay cancel after you see kind of the swords start to appear or the ground aura appear, and then you finish off on the 5th skill. Regardless of the rotation that you use, you want to use the ultimate skill at the end after you've gotten your damage accumulation. And if or when you have the T4 skill, you basically just use that whenever it's available so that you can get the most damage out of the striker as often as you can. Hela's performance in PvE is all well and good, but the main thing that people want to know is how she does in PvP with the new uniform. After rigorously testing Hela in Timeline and a bunch of the other PvP modes, I found that the new uniform does end up making her tankier, specifically because she gains that 7 seconds of invincible from the 5th skill, and also because her healing is confined to that singular skill, the 5th skill, as opposed to being split between her 4th and her 5th skill, so that means she only needs to hit 1 skill to get the healing off as opposed to 2 of them. I also noticed that her offense or burst potential with this uniform improved. Oftentimes she would use the 3rd skill but not really activate the counter aspect of it and then go into her 5th skill. and while sitting in the 5th skill, she would accumulate damage, and the opponent would sometimes just sit in their own iframe, or possibly they're invincible, but the skill is so long that they would basically come out of it and then take the full brunt of the accumulated damage. The other added offense improvement with this uniform is that the 3rd skill now has super guard break, so if the counter effect actually triggers, then the opponent will be locked down for about a second or so that Hela can follow up with another attack if they haven't died, and potentially knock them out if their invincible doesn't proc. You'll notice from these clips that I'm able to take down Wolverine in 1 life, even though they have the artifact that gives them immortality, and that's because of the challenger buffs that allow me to bypass that. But the main reason I included that is to kind of showcase how much better the character would be if Hela actually had a built-in effect like that, where she could bypass immortal effects. Especially since she doesn't have iframe ignore or penetration, it would really help her to have another kind of meta effect that could impact the top characters and give her more value overall as a standalone character. You can also see from this clip that she does much better versus opponents that don't have debuff cleanse, since she does have a lot of CC effects, but still struggles versus opponents that have short cooldowns on their iframe ignore skills and that iframe frequently. Despite these improvements, the character is still not good enough to be used in timeline, at least as a standalone character, because of the main flaw that she can't hit opponents that are in iframe, and basically just has to either look out if you're using something like CTP regen for the top proc to interrupt their skill, or for the counter skill, the 3rd skill, to potentially hit them when they briefly jump out of their iframe skill. To showcase to you that the new uniform isn't outright better and doesn't nearly provide a significant level of improvement to the character, I also tested her or the same teams with her using the old uniform, and you can see here that she performs pretty much just as well, if not better. In fact, versus certain opponents that have very short iframes and have frequent iframe ignore skills, sometimes it's better to use the old uniform since she can use that 3rd skill counterattack more frequently. You'll see from this clip that even though I was able to take down Thanos with the old uniform, I was able to do it much more easily with the new one. I basically noticed that for opponents that don't have very many iframes and don't have short cooldowns on their iframe ignores, that the new uniform does perform better since you can do more burst damage to them in a shorter period of time, and you can also just stay in that invincible and partial iframe on the 5th skill. However, versus opponents that do iframe frequently and have a short cooldown on their iframe ignore, the old uniform does seem to perform more consistently there, since it's not stuck in that 5th skill animation and can frequently use that counter attack on the 3rd skill to potentially one-shot the opponent when they're transitioning between skills. You can see exactly what I'm talking about if you face Jean with Hela's new uniform. Hela will basically just sit in the 5th skill while Jean constantly iframe ignores and jumps around her and essentially just whittles her down to her artifact and then ends up killing her while she doesn't really do anything. However, if you face her with the old uniform, you'll see that she frequently uses her 3rd skill in between all of Jean's skills to potentially just burst her down. And in this particular clip, you'll see that I was able to take out at least 1 life of the character with the old uniform compared to the new uniform. In terms of the build for the character, you definitely can go with Destruction if you want to go on the offensive side. It gives her the penetration and some additional burst damage from the damage proc. However, I find that with the new uniform, she doesn't use the 3rd skill nearly as frequently as the old uniform, which really benefited from the damage proc and the penetration. So for that reason, I would probably recommend building her more defensively. If you want to go on the defensive side, you basically have 3 options. A Steel Authority allows you to be the most defensive, I guess, since you can get the semi-immortal effect from stacking up that damage reduction, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it since you won't really gain much benefit from the invincible on the bottom proc, considering that she has 7 seconds on her 5th skill now. For that reason, I think a CTP of Conquest would probably give her more value since she gains the extra healing from it, as well as additional offensive capabilities to potentially allow her to bypass some of those invincible procs. I don't often recommend regen anymore because it doesn't have that super guard break immunity, but because the character doesn't have an iframe ignore, she's not really going to be used in a standalone situation most of the times. You basically are going to pair her with a strong meta character, which is why I feel regen is kind of the most ideal option for her. She already has super armor in her kit, so you don't really have to worry too much about the super guard break, and the constant interruption from the regen will not only protect her, but also the meta character that you pair her up with. And the obvious added survivability from the healing and that little HP shield will allow the character to reach the T3 more often, gaining the penetration that you would have from destruction, as well as activating the T4 skill if you have the character at T4, which would basically allow her to wipe out anyone that's remaining. As I showed in the previous clip, Hela with her old uniform did end up performing more consistently against this team that I'm fighting against. Oftentimes the new uniform would just end up dying versus Jean at the start, but with that brilliant regen, sometimes you can get lucky and have it interrupt some important skills, and then Hela would be able to just wipe out the team completely, considering obviously that she is one-shotting Wolverine with the challenger buffs. Otherwise, she would basically just die versus him. Either way, you can see that the old uniform still holds up, and in many ways, the new uniform is just a side grade and not really an upgrade. They would need to provide some really solid buffs to the new uniform for it to just be outright better than the old uniform, and for now, you don't really need the new uniform for the character to perform in PvP. If anything, I would kind of recommend that if you can spare the T4 materials, that you get Hela to T4, since having her survive to her T4 skill or even her T3 skill is what will make the biggest difference in PvP rather than the uniform that you use. Just keep in mind that if you do choose to T4 the character, she won't be a standalone character since she doesn't have the skills to do that, but she will be a pretty good hybrid of a support character and potentially stand alone in certain situations. The main value that you will get from Hela will be specifically in Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle, but again, I do have to highlight that the character is just not going to be good standalone, specifically if you face off versus opponents that just iframe frequently, or even ones that have an awakening skill that go into an iframe. She will really struggle because she doesn't have that iframe ignore in her kit. Again, to highlight that she isn't a standalone character and to show that the new uniform didn't really provide a significant enough of an improvement, this is the team that I would usually use versus the Thanos, Hela, and support teams, and it would generally just be able to burst down everyone before they're able to do anything. The speed team that I'm using usually wins 90% of the time that I'm facing off versus Thanos and Hela, which shows me that the new uniform didn't provide nearly enough of an improvement to her to change this outcome. Sometimes when it does end up failing, Hela will be the last one to survive, then you can just use a team to specifically target her in the follow-up set, which would be someone like Captain Marvel or even having Ebony Maw on the team to get a benefit versus her. Again, the character didn't get nearly enough of an improvement in PvP as she should have gotten, but like I mentioned previously, she did show signs of being more consistent versus opponents that didn't iframe as frequently and didn't have a very short iframe ignore cooldown in their skill set. So you can use that information to your benefit. As you can see in this clip, I'm facing off versus Carnage, who doesn't have either of those, and because most often people will use a refinement on him or a greed, you don't have to worry about the invincible or lack of penetration being that much of a problem. Even though she does have more value in Alliance Conquest now because she is more consistent, being able to survive up to the T3 or T4 skill, her biggest improvement in value will be in Otherworld Battle. If you use her right at the start, which is what I would recommend, and give her a good T4 skill with that penetration, she should be able to survive pretty much enough to be able to use that skill, and once the striker skill from her T4 activates, and if it's someone like Spider-Man, it will be able to wipe out multiple characters on the other team. Just make sure that if you use her in Otherworld Battle at T4, you position her away from Ghost Rider or characters that can one-shot her off the start, so that you can try to survive as long as possible with that artifact keeping her alive too, so that you can go into the T3 and T4. So basically, to summarize from this video, the most value that you will get from Hela will be from her T4 upgrade, more so than her uniform upgrade. The new uniform does allow her to be a little bit more consistent versus opponents that don't iframe too frequently and that their iframe ignore cooldown isn't too short. So for those opponents, you can actually perform a little bit better with the new uniform, but the old uniform should suffice just as well and does end up performing a little bit more consistently versus opponents that are kind of the opposite of that end up iframing frequently and have a short cooldown on their iframe ignore skill. The new uniform also gives the added advantage that the character becomes much more usable in things like World Boss Legend. So for a newer account, she is a pretty solid pickup since you get the added value of her being good in World Boss Legend. She's definitely decent in Giant Boss Raid and somewhat passable in ABX and ABL. But for most other people, I don't think that this is an absolute buy for the character, and you should be able to actually get by with the old uniform without noticing any huge detriment to the character at all. In fact, I would urge the devs to buff her kit by either adding an iframe ignore to the third skill or somewhere else in her skills or passive. And if they don't want to do that for whatever reason, which again doesn't make sense to me because they're trying to push this character for PvP and that is where she has value, then at least give her penetration somewhere in her kit so that if she is facing off versus meta characters, she actually has a chance of potentially hitting them outside of using a CTP of destruction and hurting her survivability. The design for her new kit really doesn't make any sense, and the devs really need to buckle down and figure out where they want to push characters in what direction and actually give them the tools to be able to excel in those modes. For now, don't really worry so much about the uniform and just focus more so on the T4 if you can get that. I'm going to take a look to see what the next video will be, but if you liked this one, found it entertaining or useful, then please consider liking and subscribing and potentially sharing it with others. It could help them and it definitely helps my channel grow. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.